Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In this episode, I wanted to discuss one of the fundamental conditions that has been mentioned in the Quran for someone to have true faith, for someone to have true iman in Allah. And that is certainty. Having absolute yaqeen that there is an Allah, there is heaven and hell, there are angels and iblis, and that we will be standing in front of Allah on the day of judgment. In other words, having absolute certainty about things that we cannot scientifically prove, things that we cannot sense. That is one of the fundamental aspects of Iman that has been mentioned in the opening verses of Surah Baqarah in the Quran. Now, interestingly, when you tell this to someone, when you go and tell any Muslim that it's important for you to have yaqeen and certainty, otherwise Iman is not yet there, you're not really a true believer. Every Muslim will say, of course I have yaqeen. Of course I believe in Allah, the heaven, hell, angels. I believe in all of that because I'm a Muslim. But the truth is that most of us don't actually understand what yaqeen and certainty even implies, what it means. When you have absolute certainty that you will be accountable for every single action of yours, and you are absolutely certain that there is a Jahannam which needs to be feared, and a Jannah which is beautiful and we need to strive for, then none of us would commit sins deliberately. Yes, we would still make mistakes. We would do things by accident. We would commit sins because we have forgotten. But none of us would do sins voluntarily, knowing that we're doing something which is wrong. Okay? None of us would actually ignore the commands of Allah. None of us would say that, okay, I know I have to do my 5-time prayers, but I'm just too lazy. I just cannot be bothered. It's just too hard for me to actually wake up for the time of Fajr. I know that I need to be studying tafsir, but I just don't have time. I have so many other things to do. I cannot even give 10 minutes. We would not be saying these things if you had absolute certainty that you will be standing in front of Allah and He will question you about how you spent your life, about how you spent your time. That is what yaqeen and certainty actually means. So when Allah says that in the opening verses of Surah Baqarah, that someone who will be able to attain guidance from the Quran, someone who is really a true Muslim, a true believer, is someone who has yaqeen, someone who has certainty, we need to understand what certainty actually means. So if I were to tell you that don't leave your room because there is a deadly snake outside, if you have doubt about what I'm saying, you might still have this fear inside of you, but you would still open the door and walk outside. But if you have complete certainty that I'm not lying, that I'm being very honest, you will never open the door and go out. So that's really the difference between having certainty and having a little bit of doubt. Majority of us have doubt. We don't say it, so we tell everyone that yes, we have certainty, but if you look at our actions, we actually have doubt. And just to give you another example for you to understand this, at times when you're doing something which your parents have told you not to do, they have forbidden you from doing it. If you have absolute certainty that you will be caught, your parents are definitely going to find out. There is no way that you can hide this or that you can escape this. You will panic so much. You will be terrified. You will freak out so much that your mind will be constantly consumed with this thing that my parents are definitely going to find out. What am I going to do? But if you have doubt, and if you don't believe that your parents are really going to find out, you will continue doing the thing that they have forbidden you from doing. The same is the case with Allah. So while we say we have certainty, the fact that we are still doing things which we know Allah does not allow, or the fact that we just don't care about what Allah wants, that shows that we actually do not have certainty, we have doubt. But then, of course, the question is, how do you get certainty? How can you truly, certainly believe in a God that you've never seen? In angels and iblis that you've never seen, in heaven and hell that you've never seen or heard or felt? How can you believe in all of these things that are so important, yet none of them can actually be felt by your senses? None of them can be scientifically proven. They all are part of bil ghaib. They are part of the unseen world. The road to certainty starts with having doubt. So if you are someone in the beginning who opens up the Quran, you read verses and you have doubt, it doesn't really click. So in other words, you open up the Quran, you read verses, and you don't just blindly accept it. It's not like you say, okay, if Allah is saying this, it must have definitely happened. There is a bit of doubt in your heart. That is perfectly normal. That is the way, in fact, it should be. And the reason is because in order for you to get to certainty, you have to first have doubt, and then you have to start learning to ask a lot of questions. The more questions you ask, the more research you do, the more you reflect and ponder, the more likely it is that you will then attain a stage where you are certain that everything is true, and you are certain a day of accountability will take place, even though you cannot scientifically prove anything. And this is actually key. This is what I wanted to emphasize, because normally, as teachers, when we are talking to our students in academics, in the field of science, or in any other field, we encourage our students to ask questions. We encourage them to ponder, to reflect, to do extra research. If there is a student who asks a lot of questions, we like it. We encourage it. We think, okay, this kid is always thinking outside of the box. This is so good for him. This is so healthy for him. But when it comes to religion, and there is somebody who asks a lot of questions, we start getting angry. Okay, especially, when you have a child who asks his parents a lot of questions about the Quran. Why does Allah say this? Allah tells us to do this. Why should we do it? Allah talks about all of these things, but why are these things there? Why is there heaven and hell in the first place? Why will there be a day of judgment? What's the purpose of even having a Jahannam? The more questions that kids ask, parents actually get angry. Or they start freaking out and they start thinking, okay, my kid is going to become a kafir. He's going to become a disbeliever because he's asking too many questions. And we don't realize that the road to certainty starts by having doubt and starts by asking a lot of questions. If you ever in the Old Testament, if you read the story of Ibrahim a.s. when he was a child, ever since the age of 4 or 5 years old, he started asking all kinds of amazing questions to his father, because his father, he used to worship idols. And in fact, he was a prominent figure in the society at that time, somebody who would also propagate the message of idol worship. And so being a son, Ibrahim alayhi salam never understood the concept of idol worship, and that's why he never worshipped any idols. What always made sense to his mind was the worship of one God. And then it explains his story that a child who's so young, he's only 5 years old, he asks such amazing questions that even his father he's baffled. And even his father doesn't have the answer to everything. So for example, it mentions that on one occasion, Ibrahim alayhi salam is talking to his father and he says, well, since all of you have actually created, you've actually made these gods with your hands, who came first? Was it man or was it the gods? And so of course his father said, well, of course it was the gods. And then Ibrahim alayhi salam said, but how? Because the gods have to be made by man, since you are the ones who are creating these idols. So the gods could not have come first, it has to be man. But then if man came first, then who created man? And so these were such amazing questions that you're supposed to ask, because the more you think and ponder, the more it makes sense to you that there has to only be one God who's the creator of all these idols, cannot be gods. And his father, of course, could not answer these questions. His father understood what Ibrahim alayhi salam was trying to imply. His father knew that Ibrahim alayhi salam was making sense, but he didn't want to address those things. So instead, he would just scold his son, and he would tell his son, stop asking these questions, and if you don't want to worship idols, that's fine, but don't ask me any more questions about my gods. This is what we have to learn, that even when it comes to prophets, before they became prophets, even as kids, they were asking brilliant questions. And when it comes to Islam, because the concept of Tawheed is so simple, it's so beautiful, it makes sense to the ruh, to the soul, and it makes sense to the mind. If we have a young generation who's asking us questions, we need to encourage that, and we need to do our own research so we can answer those questions, because Islam as a religion has been perfected by Allah. This is what has been mentioned in the Quran. So when our kids, or when the young generation asks questions about prayers and about rituals. Why do we have to do this? Why do we have to do that? Why is there a Sharia? What exactly is an ummah? Why were we created? What is the purpose? There are answers to all of those questions, and the answers are brilliant. They make sense to the mind. This is what we have to understand, that it's important for us to ask questions. It's important for us to do research, because the more you ask, the more you reflect, the easier it will be for you to understand the beauty and the wisdom of Islam, and then you will have certainty. Now, in this situation, there is one other thing I do want to mention. When you look at Adam alayhi salam, who was the very first man to be created, before Adam alayhi salam was sent down to the earth, when he was still up in the heavens, there was a demonstration that he did. Okay, he was told by Allah to make this demonstration in front of the angels and also in front of Iblis. And I won't get into the demonstration because that will make this podcast very long. But the demonstration revolved around illustrating the intellectual mind of Adam alayhi salam. And the idea was, Allah was trying to explain to the angels, to Iblis, to everyone, that insan has a very, very intellectual mind. Okay, he has the capacity to deduce and infer and reason unlike any other creation. Okay, the ability of insan is far beyond that of any other creation. That's how intellectual our mind is. So what was the point of giving us such an intellectual mind if we're told, don't ask questions when it comes to Islam? Just believe. As soon as you open up the book of God and you're reading the verses, it's from Allah, so just accept it. No, that's not the way you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to read. You're supposed to ask questions. When you have doubt about certain verses, you are supposed to do research. Your mind is very intellectual for this reason, that the more you think, the more you ask questions, the more you ponder, the more you will be able to dig deep into Islam. You will be able to understand then the wisdom of Islam. Because on the outside, Islam just seems like a very simple religion. And a lot of things will not make sense. But when you start to ask the more important questions and you dig deep, that's when you start to understand the wisdom, the beauty of it. And that is exactly what Allah wants. And so when you study the Quran as well, you realize that Allah keeps telling us in the Quran to ask questions. He keeps telling us to look around, study the environment, observe, reflect, ponder, because that was the purpose of giving us an incredibly intellectual mind. Now, before I end this podcast, one question that many students have is that, yes, okay, we understand the importance of asking questions, but still, how can you have certainty and how can you believe in something that you cannot even see or hear? Our senses are very, very important. So if you cannot see something or hear something, or feel something, how can we know that these things exist in reality? It doesn't matter how much you use your intellectual mind, you cannot ever have certainty in these things. The answer to that question is actually very simple. If I'm holding a very, very expensive phone and I were to just let go, why would everyone around me start to shout and scream? Because they know with certainty that the phone is going to fall to the ground. Now, how do they know that? How do they know that the phone is not going to stay up there in the air? It won't be floating. How do they know it's going to definitely come and fall down? Because there's something called gravity. Now, can you see gravity? Can you hear it? Can you hold it in your hands and feel it? Is it a tangible thing? It's not. But how do we know with certainty that this gravitational force that we cannot even see or hear is definitely there and it's going to pull this phone down to the ground? Because at some point we did our research and we started to realize that whatever goes up must come down. We started to realize that there is a pull, a force that is pulling everything down towards the earth, pulling everything down towards the ground. That is something we ended up calling gravity. And that's how we have certainty of something that actually cannot be seen or heard or held in your hand even. You cannot smell it, you cannot taste it, but you are certain that it does exist. So this idea that you can never have certainty of Allah or of heaven and hell because you cannot see it, well, that's not true. Our mind is certain of many things which actually cannot be sensed, but we are sure of it because we have deduced it using our mind, using our intellect. We have inferred that this thing must exist. And that is why I know for sure that if I let go of the phone, it is definitely going to go down. There is no way that it's going to stay floating up there. Therefore, in the same way, we have to have certainty about the Day of Judgment and about Allah and all the things that are part of Bil Ghaib. But in order to get to that level, the first thing is to have doubt and then to start asking questions and doing the research. So if you're someone who opens up the Quran, you're going over the verses, things don't make sense to you, they don't just click you and they don't hit you hard in the heart, that's normal. That's the way it's supposed to be. That's not a reason for you to think that Allah's not guiding you, there's something wrong with you. That is perfectly normal. Now the next step, use that intellectual mind to start asking questions and then conduct the research that is needed to find the answers. Because the more you dig deep into Islam, the more it's going to make sense to you. May Allah guide us all. May Allah forgive us all of our sins. May Allah enable us all to propagate the message of Islam. And may Allah grant us all salvation. Assalamu alaikum.